So, here is some background. Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. The only country poorer is Haiti, which is significantly poorer. Nicaragua was never a rich country, and today it is still trying to overcome the effects of dictatorship, civil war, and natural calamities. Most of the country's wealth and industry is in the hands of the select few, those in power mostly, while the majority of the population continues to live in poverty and suffer. So, Nicaragua was first discovered by Spanish explorers around 1522, and all through the 16th, 17th, and even 18th century to some regard, Nicaragua shifted from the hands of the British to the Spanish to the Mexican before it was granted a quasi-independence in 1838. In 1893, Jose Santos Zelaya seized power of the country and established a dictatorship. And this was quite terrible for the people of Nicaragua. There was a lot of bloodshed, a lot of carnage. And this dictator was eventually deposed by the United States, who used their military action as a reason to establish military bases in the country, therefore kind of taking a stake in the country of Nicaragua, which made a lot of people unhappy and uncomfortable. So, in 1933, Augusto Sandino and other guerrilla forces led a campaign against the U.S. military presence in Nicaragua. This was a more liberal movement that was aiming at the idea that Nicaragua should control its own affairs and be in charge of itself as a country. In 1937, Sandino was assassinated, and the Somoza family, led by General Somoza, took power of the country, beginning a 44-year family-run dictatorship. So this dictatorship yet again crippled the country, hurt the people, and continued Nicaragua's downward spiral into a country of poverty and limited infrastructure and innovation and technological development. So in 1980, there was something called the Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua, which ended up killing and deposing the Somozas. And having instead a more liberal and Marxist-run government. The U.S. was very concerned about this liberal government. It was in the Cold War era. They were not a big fan of socialists, communists, Marxists. These were all big threats to the U.S., threats to the U.S. democracy, but also threats to U.S. interest in the region. A socialist government is going to be less likely to engage in trade with a communist country. So, the U.S. government decided to sponsor the Contra rebels in order to try to undermine the democratically elected Sandinista government, which at that time was led by Daniel Ortega. So the U.S. attacked, they sponsored the Contras, they provided weapons, and they were ultimately condemned by the international community for engaging in such rash involvement in the affairs of another country. And the Sandinistas managed to hold on to power, but not without more violence and unrest and just general dispute in the country that was in a vital part of its existence where it needed to be building infrastructure and building its economy. So ultimately, Ortega was elected president. He was then voted out, and actually recently in 2006, he was re-elected to president, and he remains the president to this day. So as you can see, the country of Nicaragua has a deep and dark history of violence, turmoil, and U.S. political intervention. They have a weakened economy, limited infrastructure, and many people live in poverty and survive on basic subsistence. Their main exports are sugar, coffee, tobacco, and cattle. Nicaragua has a GDP of about $1,850 per year. Is a GDP per capita. Almost half of the population lives in rural areas, and 68 of these Rural people live on less than $1 per day. There's about a 20% unemployment rate in these rural areas. So Nicaragua has a long way to go, and this poverty, political turmoil, and lack of infrastructure is a main determinant and explanation for why they continue to struggle with clean water and sanitation issues.